Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining. I was genuinely excited about the fact that so many people were interested in listening to me talk about our modeling work in the US, which I guess is off the back of the release that came out a few weeks ago. So our partnership with First Street, which I'll go into in some detail. But my talk today, the kind of general outline will be an introduction to Fathom, so a really brief introduction to who we are and what we do. And principally talking about flood hazard mapping in the US and where the context of our work sits in the US. I'm then going to talk about how we've gone about modeling under different climate scenarios. So that's not only future climate scenarios, it's also trying to update for a current climate. And then talk about some of the validation work that's gone into the data, which will hopefully give you some faith that these new data have some skill and are useful. And I'll finish off talking about some of our CAT modeling capabilities. So any insurers out there will probably be interested in hearing about some of the CAT modeling work that we do. And I finish up with a look forward to the next things that are on the horizon for us. So to kind of set the scene a little bit, and this is probably not needed for this audience, but I thought I'd kind of outline the problem. Flooding is a very costly peril. It's the costliest natural disaster in the world. In the US, if you just look at the 10 costliest floods over the last few decades, the numbers are kind of eye-watering. So we're well over $200 billion in overall losses. And more importantly, it's cost thousands of lives. And it's going to get worse. So even if we don't consider climate change, if we just look at changes in exposure, so changes in where people are going to be living, then we see that there's going to be a significant increase in the number of people and assets exposed to flooding over the next century. And that's something that's unique not to the US. So that's something that we see for the whole planet. So it's something of a byproduct of increasing urbanization. So people are forced to live in fringe areas. So areas in cities that are not occupied for a good reason are going to be developed over the coming century. So what can we do about this problem? So what you can see on your screen at the moment is a representation of a two-dimensional flood model. And hopefully it's not too laggy on your screens, but what this is meant to depict is the kind of modeling that we could do like 15 years ago. So it's not cutting edge, but it's a really detailed, what we term engineering type flood model. What is it doing? Well, it's simulating the flow of water across the Earth's surface. At its heart, it's solving the Navier-Stokes equations, and those were actually derived 150 years ago by Claude Navier and George Stokes. So there's really nothing novel and new in this model. But I wanted to show this slide because it really does depict what we can do when we have lots of information and lots of data. So we can build really detailed flood models that are actually within error of observation. So the model that you can see on your screen is a simulation of a city in the UK. And we have really detailed terrain data sets. So we have LiDAR data. We have measurements of the river channel. So engineers have been out and surveyed river channel sizes. We have observations of river flow on all those rivers. And when we start plugging all those things together, we can build really detailed models. And as I've said, they're actually, this model itself is within error of the observations of the event itself. So what does that mean? Well, it's as good as we can test it to be. And that's really fantastic. However, the real challenge for the scientific field of flood modeling was moving from small scales to large scales. So what happens when we want to build models, not of an individual river, but of say every river in America? Like, how do we do that? The kinds of models on the left-hand side, those engineering type models, need a lot of data, and that data has to be of high quality. And they've typically required a lot of manual work. And consequently, they've been really costly to build. And in fact, when we look globally, what we see just a few years ago was that for the majority of the planet, no flood hazard information existed, largely because of the data required to build these kinds of models. So that's actually why we ended up forming Fathom. So to give you a brief introduction to my background, so I did a PhD at the University of Bristol, which is a place where two-dimensional grid-based flood models were pioneered. And our research was we had a lot of ties with the insurance world, and we realized that the kinds of models that we were developing had a lot of application, I guess, in the real world. Principally by insurers, but also by other organizations like the World Bank. And Fathom set out to build models in difficult places. So we wanted to build models really anywhere in the world. And we are now building models that cover the whole planet. One of the things that I think is critical to state about Fathom is that we are a research-led organization. What does that mean? Well, we publish all of our methods in world-leading journals. And over the last few years, we've published a bunch of seminal papers from validation of large-scale models through to the methodologies that sit behind our global model. And we will be publishing a paper that outlines in detail the methodology behind our US data. So what are the main obstacles that we have to overcome? And this applies not just to the US, but also globally. Well, we actually wrote down a list, this is going back about 8 years. We wrote down a list of the things that we thought you have to solve in order to enable these two-dimensional grid-based flood models to be built anywhere in the world. Now, by some distance, the most difficult thing that we have to solve globally is terrain data. It's kind of simple, actually. If you don't have a good terrain data set, then you're not going to have a very good flood model. Water flows downhill, so if you don't know where downhill is, then your model is going to be pretty poor. We're kind of lucky in the US in that we have the national elevation data set. And I've called the data set that we use NED Plus because we're actually supplementing the national elevation data set. But there are still areas of the US where we don't have ideal terrain data sets, and we don't have LiDAR, so laser altimetry data is really what we want. And globally, again, it's the primary problem in building these kinds of models around the world. Discharge estimation is also a really significant problem. Again, globally, it's more of a problem, but even in the US, even though there are many thousands of gauges across the US, they still don't cover every single river in America. So we have to come up with ways to estimate extreme flows for all river channels. And we have to represent the river channels themselves. So we need to represent not only the location, but the size of the river channels everywhere, if we want to be able to represent the dynamics of floodplain wetting and drying properly. Again, we're really lucky in the US in that we have the National Hydrography data set, which is a really great data set, mapping where rivers are. But we also need to know how big they are. And so Fathom has developed an innovative channel solver that links the size of river channels to our estimates of discharge. And we have a paper coming out on that shortly. Defenses in the US is something that I'm going to cover in a little more detail in a few slides' time. But it goes without saying that representing defenses in America is really important. There are really significant defense structures nationwide. Unfortunately, there's no complete defense data set in the US. I think our estimates of the Army Corps' own defense data set is that it's around 30% complete. But we've undertaken a multi-organization collaboration, and we've also funded research to try and build out our observations or our databases of defenses across the US. Now, the last 2 points are probably a little bit boring, but they're really important. We're solving some somewhat complex physics in these models. And if we're doing it at large scales, like all of America, at a high resolution, which you have to for a peril like flooding, then the models have to be efficient. So we've done a lot of work building out efficient models. And the last one really is what separates the kind of work that we do from existing models. And that is automation. So if you want to have comprehensive models of all of America, then this has to be built in something of an automated way. Why is that? Well, building manual type models, so models in isolation. Federal agencies have been trying to do this for years, and they've spent billions of dollars doing it. And unfortunately, America is a very, very big place with lots of rivers. So building out comprehensive data sets of all of America in a manual way just simply isn't really possible. So automation has to be an important part of what we do. Fathom, very quickly. So we now work with a whole bunch of organizations. We work with insurers, we work with the World Bank, we work with conservation agencies, we work with engineers, and we work with First Street. So First Street are an organization that we've partnered with, and you've probably seen we released our data to the US public last week. So if we turn our focus to the US, and I think why the kinds of models that we build are useful in the US. Well, if we look at the modeling work that FEMA has undertaken over the last few decades, FEMA build these small scale models across the US. And I want to emphasize a point now, which I'll probably emphasize again throughout the talk. And that is that we're not saying that our models are better than FEMA's data where they exist. Particularly the high quality FEMA models undertaken recently. We're absolutely not saying that our models are better than those models. We're just stating that our models are useful in providing comprehensive views of risk. What does that mean? Well, FEMA will openly tell you that they don't map 40% of the US. And actually, if you look at the areas that they do map, what you can see is that by their own definition of what is out of date, 75% of those data are out of date. And actually, if we look at areas in which FEMA state they have coverage, what we see is that they often miss lots of the headwater regions, typically kind of small rivers. And what you can see on your screen at the moment is a comparison of an area in which FEMA state they have coverage and Fathom's data. So the blue is the Fathom 100-year data, and the red is FEMA's data. What our work has shown, actually over the last few years, and this is version 1 of our US model that was released a couple of years ago, what we showed is that this patchwork of models that FEMA has actually results in there being a significant underestimation of exposure and risk. We actually published a paper on this back in 2018, and this is something that we teamed up with the EPA on, and we used their population maps to explore the number of people exposed to flooding in the US. And what we found was that there was a threefold increase when we used the Fathom data as opposed to the FEMA flood data. And just a little point to make is that when we use the EPA's own projections of where people are going to be living in the US, what we found was that there was an almost doubling of exposure towards the end of the century. And again, this makes no account for changes in hazard. So it's not talking about changes in climate or amplifications in hazard. This is just where people are going to be living. But I guess the most important point here, do these models have skill? Well, back to version 1 of our model, as soon as we built the model, really, we wanted to explore whether the model had skill. And the way in which we did that was to validate it against FEMA data where it exists. And again, this should give an indication of how we view FEMA's data, in that we use FEMA's data as a validation data set. So we think FEMA data, where it exists and where it's new, is really, really great data. It's our validation benchmark. Now, what this paper showed was that we could largely replicate FEMA's data where it exists. This is something that we published in collaboration with Google, and we validated against the whole FEMA catalog and against high quality FEMA data. But the version 2 of our model has had a lot of work undertaken on it. It's something that we've been working on over the past 2 years. We've teamed up with First Street in the US, who've been a fantastic collaborator and allowing us to spend a lot of time and giving us a lot of resource to improve the modeling. What does version 2 of our model entail? Well, significant improvements to the pluvial and fluvial modeling. Previously, we didn't have coastal, we didn't do coastal areas, but we spent a lot of time building out coastal models for both the western and eastern the west and east coasts. This includes hurricane models, so explicitly simulating storm surges. We've spent a lot of time building out flood defenses across the US. And importantly, we're simulating under different climate scenarios. And that includes what we're calling a 2020 view of risk. So we're not basing the model purely on observations alone. We're using climate models and we're using hurricane models to update the boundary conditions that would have previously just been based on observations. And we've also undertaken model simulations under a future climate scenario. And this data is what was released last week. And again, is something that I would assume most of you saw in the press. So our new data, again, it covers pluvial flooding. So this is something that FEMA don't simulate, but we're simulating flash flooding. We're also simulating fluvial inundation, where we're plugging in river flows into river channels and explicitly simulating channel overtopping and inundation of floodplain areas. And we've also simulated coastal inundation for multiple forms of coastal flooding across the US. What do these data look like? Well, we've released them principally at 10-meter resolution. It's nationwide. We're explicitly simulating all channels, so it's every river from big rivers down to really small streams. For those of you interested, the threshold for when we begin simulating fluvial inundation is any channel with an upstream area greater than 50 square kilometers is represented as a fluvial process. This is 100% coverage of the US, so we're simulating all of the 48 lower states. The flows are generated from the USGS record. I'm going to point out that I'm not going to go into any great detail about different parts of the modeling chain here, because it's, as you can imagine, it's a really significant modeling framework, but we can chat through on subsequent calls if people are interested in how we do things like derived boundary conditions. Gavin is going to go through this, but more than happy to set up subsequent calls to talk through that. But for the fluvial model, the flows are generated from the USGS record. We're simulating multiple return periods. So we're actually simulating 10 return periods, and they range from a 1 in 5 year event through to a 1 in 1,000 year event. And we have what we feel is a much more comprehensive representation of defenses. It's a similar story for the pluvial model, except the pluvial model really does begin to capture inundation on small flow pathways. So we're representing inundation on really small channels. Again, it's 100% coverage of the US. The boundary conditions are derived from NOAA precipitation estimates. So we're using intensity, duration, frequency relationships that are provided by NOAA to drive these models. And again, it's multiple return periods. So we're simulating 10 return periods nationwide. Just a small point on the pluvial data. This is really where a lot of our insurance clients often tell us that there's a lot of value in the kinds of models that we produce. Again, this peril is not covered in the FEMA catalog, but insurers often term flooding on these small channels as being off floodplain. Of course, it's not off floodplain, it's just that these floodplains are really, really small. But our ability to capture inundation on these small flow pathways is really provides a lot of benefit to our data. The coastal model, again, it's a similar kind of story in that it's nationwide, multiple return periods from a 1 in 5 to a 1 in 1,000 year event. We're explicitly simulating compound flooding. What does that mean? Well, we're simulating the interaction of things like flood waves interacting with storm surges. And we're simulating an updated 2020 view of risk. Now, this is particularly important for Gulf regions of the US, because we're already seeing changes in hurricane behavior. So this is where we do see more significant changes even under the 2020 model simulations. I mentioned defenses, and I guess it's an obvious thing to state, but representing defenses is really important. The images you can see on your screen at the moment are from version 1 of our US model, and it's Sacramento in California. And what you can see is what a simulation looks like when you don't have levees in it. There are significant levee structures around the city, and if you don't represent them properly, then you end up with a view of exposure that's really not true. So something that we identified a few years ago was the need to build out more comprehensive defense data sets in the US. And this has taken multiple forms. So we have partnerships with people like First Street, but also with agencies in the US that have allowed us to build out more comprehensive defense estimates. We've also funded research. So we funded a PhD that looked at building out ways to, an automated way to detect flood defenses. So using high resolution terrain data to pick out defenses. But one of the big improvements that's come over the last 12 to 18 months has been our partnership with First Street. because that's really allowed us to have a significant human resource, pooling together things like dam structures, storm drains, levee structures across the US. And we actually ran the model last year. So an initial run of our new US model ran last year, but it was then exposed to scrutiny by a large team of developers at First Street, who went through the data set and identified areas in which the model wasn't performing as it should. Now that could be because it was not validating well against FEMA data, or it could be because we're exposing populations in really high frequency events. So perhaps we're getting large areas of towns wet at really high return periods or low return periods. And that needed more scrutiny. So this feedback loop has existed over the past year. And the image on your screen is essentially meant to depict what this has looked like. So it's kind of just been a bunch of Slack streams. And some of our team, some of our developers have essentially spent the last 12 months of their lives looking at this kind of feedback loop, where we're trying to identify where the model perhaps isn't performing as it should. And can we go in and can we improve the model? But it's not just under a current climate scenario. So our collaboration with First Street has enabled us to team up with a whole bunch of organizations in the US. And this is really providing what we feel is the most comprehensive view of future risk in the US. Now, this is not just Fathom. Again, we work with a bunch of organizations, so all kind of led by First Street. We've worked with people like MIT and use their hurricane models under a 2020 climate and a 2050 climate. What are the kinds of things that we've simulated? Well, we've simulated changes to extreme precipitation. We're simulating changes in sea level rise. The hurricane models include changes in sea surface temperature. We've actually simulated 3 scenarios. So it's 2020, 2035, and 2050. For now, it's the 4.5 emission scenario. It may be that we end up simulating additional emission scenarios, but for now it's just the 4.5. But we have simulated multiple realizations of the 4.5 emission scenario. So we've simulated a low, medium, and high emission scenario. And again, it's covering all the major climate-driven forms of inundation. So we're simulating flash flooding, we're simulating fluvial inundation, and we're simulating coastal inundation under multiple climate scenarios. Again, this is something that you probably saw last week, but we're releasing the data to the US public, so you can go in and enter an address and get an indication of exposure for that property. Now, something that, particularly in the insurance world, people might be thinking, well, why have we done this? These are data sets that are typically quite valuable to insurance companies. Well, from Fathom's perspective, not only does this align well with our ethos of making data available for people to use, but we think it's also going to result in a data set that significantly improves over time. Now, what does that mean? Well, there'll be a feedback loop, so you can get in touch with a team at Flood Factor and identify areas in which the model perhaps isn't performing as it should. And that's going to allow us to iteratively improve the model over time. This is what the platform looks like. You can Google it and you can enter your property if you'd like. It's designed to give you a really kind of easily digestible view of exposure. So it'll give you a score out of 10. Now that is useful for, I guess, for like the everyday person can understand easily what that metric is trying to tell them. So how exposed am I? It has limited value for people like insurance companies. So if you want access to the data that sits behind this, then Fathom can license that to you. And again, it's not only a current climate scenario, we're also providing these data on Flood Factor under a future climate scenario. So you'll get an indication of changing exposure for the property that you're searching. We've actually had some initial feedback over the past week. And this is an indication of an area in which the model is performing really poorly. So I think an engineer got in touch here and said that they essentially had no faith in the data for this particular town. And actually what we see here is that it's kind of a worst case scenario for us from a modeling perspective, because there are extensive local features. So there's local drainage networks here that weren't captured in the model. But also for this particular town, we actually had some poor terrain data sets. So it's really the worst case scenario for us from a modeling perspective. But this is really great because this identifies an area in which we need to improve the model over the next few years. But it's not all bad feedback. We've also had some positive feedback. So this is kind of anecdotal, but we've had people getting in touch, identifying areas in which our model is providing views of exposure, producing flood depths in areas in which they know get wet, and in areas that aren't captured in the existing FEMA data. And again, this is something that's been extensively covered in the US press over the last week. So I'm sure most of you have seen some of these articles, but we are really hopeful that it's going to result in a data set that improves over time. Some of the conclusions that First Street have drawn. So we have views of exposure across the US, so changes between, or differences between our data and FEMA data. And what we can see here is that this actually is unsurprising because it aligns somewhat with FEMA's own coverage data set. So parts of the Midwest are areas that we know there are is particularly lacking in FEMA hazard data. Again, perhaps unsurprising when we look at the number of people exposed. So Gulf regions, areas around Florida, the Eastern Seaboard have a large proportion of properties exposed to inundation. And also, perhaps unsurprisingly, when we look at the proportion of properties exposed over time, so looking out over our different climate scenarios, so looking from 2020 to 2050, what we see is that Gulf regions, and again, the Eastern Seaboard, are areas that see particular amplifications in the number of properties exposed. And to zoom in on a particularly bad example, so this is kind of the worst case scenario we could identify, or the worst location. So this is Houston in Texas, and what we see here is a simulation of a 100-year surge event under a 2020 climate on the left and a 2050 climate on the right. We can see there's a significant amplification in storm surge intensity. And this is what drives the numbers that I showed on the previous slide. So to give you guys a bit more faith in the data that we're producing, I'm going to chat through some validation metrics. So hopefully the last few slides didn't just sound kind of like kind of marketing fluff. We kind of want to put some substance into what we're doing. So we do validate our models as much as we can. Some of the metrics that I'm going to discuss, so we have a hit rate. So this is the proportion of wet benchmark data replicated. So 0 is no replication and 1 is full replication. That's great, but if your model is wet everywhere, then you're going to get a really good hit rate. But of course, it tells you nothing about model skill. So we also want to look at a false alarm ratio, and that's looking at the model where the model is wet and it shouldn't be. And so 0 is no false alarms. That's a good thing. So you're aiming for a 0 false alarm, and 1 is not good. So 1 is where you're getting just all false alarms. And a critical success index in terms of validating flood models. The critical success index is really the most critical way to assess a model because you're penalizing for over and under prediction. So 0 is no skill and 1 is a perfect match. Now, this is just kind of in general, when we're kind of validating models, we often don't have perfect validation data sets. So typically, and this is kind of thinking with my academic hat on, a critical success index of about 0.7 is something that we would deem to be good. So one of the things that was really useful for us was data from the Iowa Flood Center. So the Iowa Flood Center, many of you may know, have produced really high quality models in the state of Iowa. And really usefully, they also simulate under not only a 100-year event, they also simulate high frequency events. Now, this is something that has been lacking in the past. We haven't had many ways in which to validate our model for the lower return period events. When we validate our model against the Iowa Flood Center data for the 1 in 5-year event, what we see is that there's a 77% hit rate and a 15% false alarm ratio, giving us a CSI of 0.69. Now, we think this is actually really encouraging for a 1 in 5-year event when you consider that even though these models are really high quality, they're also going to be dealing with a lot of the uncertainties that we're dealing with. So things like how to estimate the size of river channels and coming up with estimates of extreme discharge. So getting a match as close as 0.7 particularly for something like a 1 in 5 year event, is encouraging. And actually, when we look out to a 1 in 100 year event, the data look largely the same. So the figure you can see depicts, what you can see is a blue is a good thing. So a blue is a match between the two data sets. And a red and a yellow is something that you don't want to see. So that's false positives and false negatives. But what we see for a 100-year event in Iowa is that our data look largely the same. So we have a 93% hit rate. Only 7% of our wet cells were deemed to be false alarms, giving us a CSI of 0.87. And that really is as good as we could hope it to be. And looking now at FEMA data. So when we look at the FEMA data nationwide, I provided two metrics here. So we're looking at a comparison in coastal areas and also a comparison nationwide. What we see in coastal areas is that, again, there's a really good match. So we have a 92% hit rate. There's a 12% false alarm ratio, giving us a CSI of 0.82. Now, I wanted to provide the validation metrics for coastal areas in isolation, because actually I think there's something of an interesting point to make here. And that is that the false alarm ratio of 12% is perhaps not surprising in coastal areas when you consider that we're simulating an updated 2020 view of risk. What does that mean? Well, largely in coastal areas, this means that, particularly in Gulf regions of the US, we're actually providing amplifications in boundary conditions. So we're going to be providing more extreme boundary conditions to our models in comparison to FEMA data. So the elevated false alarm ratio in coastal areas is perhaps unsurprising. But when we look out across the whole of the US, again, it's an 85% hit rate and a 9% false alarm ratio, giving us a CSI of 0.78. So this really does give us some faith that these models have skill. And I provided an example of where the model's not performing as well as we wanted to. And that's going to be the case in many cases across the US. So there'll be many towns and cities where our model isn't performing as it should. It's going to be a non-trivial amount of places. But when we look nationwide, what we see is that these errors begin to become in many ways kind of lost in the noise. So we do have a good match against existing FEMA data where it exists. To look at some of our data, what does it actually look like? Well, I provided some examples here in Texas. So we have a 1 in 5 year event in Texas. The red lines are levees. So we have levee structures, and these levee structures have assigned overtopping frequencies. And what you can see is that as we move up through the return periods, we see some of these levee structures being overwhelmed. But actually for downtown Dallas here, for the center of the city, we actually think that the levees in this area will hold to a 1 in a 500 year level. To look at some of our fluvial data, so again, providing estimates of conveyance for small channels in inner city areas is really important in our models. And in Dallas, we think that the city can deal with, the drainage networks can deal with a 1 in 5 year rainfall. But as we begin to move up through the return periods, we see lots of these small channels becoming active and producing exposure and ultimately risk. And I've showed this example already, but this is Houston under a 2020 climate scenario and looking at a 2050 storm surge scenario. So our data, what do they actually entail? Well, again, we're covering fluvial flooding, we're covering flash flooding, and we're covering coastal perils. It's 10 return periods, so we're moving from quite frequent events all the way through to really extreme events. These data are used for a whole range of things. So it's underwriting, exposure management, risk screening. They're being applied now across multiple industries, as they should, and that's really good to see. And again, we're simulating different climate scenarios. So it's an updated 2020 view of risk and a 2050 view of risk as well. These data, again, underpin flood factor. It's what you saw in the press release last week. But you can get access to the actual hazard data themselves. We have sample data that we're happy to provide. There's extensive documentation, and there'll be more documentation to follow. So we're in the process of writing some peer-reviewed papers that really detail the method behind these models. But the sample data and an overview of the methods are available now if you'd like to see them. Now, this will be of interest principally to any insurers on the call. I've only got 2 slides on this, which really does a disservice to the amount of work that we've done building cat models. But we not only have hazard information, we've spent the last 2 years developing catastrophe models in the US. So this moves from just hazard information to producing event sets. So we have plausible event sets covering 10,000 years and over 500,000 plausible flood events in the US. We also have bespoke vulnerability functions, so functions that link estimates of hazard to a loss. And we've published the methods behind each of these components in world-leading journals over the last few years. And the CAT model itself is available via a number of platforms. We have a number of partners who can provide access to the CAT model and hopefully make it something that's easily accessible. So lastly, the next developments. Well, what are the things that we want to work on? Well, we know that we need to work on building higher resolution models in some areas. And this links really to flash flooding in urban centers. But to enable that to happen, in many areas, we need better terrain data sets. And really, our golden wish would be to have LiDAR level terrain data sets nationwide. And we're hopeful that that is going to be something that emerges over the next few years. And if anybody's listening in has access to more LiDAR data that perhaps it seems we don't have in the existing data that you can see on flood factor, then do get in touch, because we'd love to hear from you. And identifying the small scale flood controlling structures is going to be one of the critical things that's going to enable us to converge the skill even more between large scale models and small scale models. I've shown an example whereby we're missing lots of flood control features in a particular city. That will be the case in other towns as well. So partnering up with other organizations and identifying where those structures exist and implementing them in our model frameworks will be another critical step in improving the kinds of modeling that we do. And the last point is actually moves away from hazard modeling and moves towards estimates of where people are going to be living. So if we want to have really robust views of future risk, then we need better models of where people are going to be living. So we're hopeful that there will be ensemble estimates of future populations and future urban centers that we can work with under different socioeconomic pathways.